The air in the saloon was a noxious stew of stale beer, sweat, and despair. It clung to the back of Elena's throat, a taste as bitter as the fear coiling in her gut. She stood by the wall, a ghost in a calico dress, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were bone white against her brown skin. Across the room, Jedediah Carver threw his cards down onto the felt with a gambler's flourish that failed to mask his desperation. He was losing. He had already lost his horse, his saddle, and the last of his coin. Now he was losing her. She was the final wager, a marker for a debt he could never repay. She was 17 years old, and her life was a stack of chips on a stained green table. The man across from Carver was a silhouette against the grimy window. Silas Blackwood. He was a rancher from the High Chaparral, a place spoken of in whispers as a sun-scorched purgatory. Men said he was as hard and unforgiving as the land he worked. He rarely came to town, and when he did, he moved with a weighted stillness that drew no attention and yet held it all the same. He didn't smile, didn't drink to excess, didn't speak unless spoken to. Now he looked at his cards, his face an unreadable mask of granite and shadow. His eyes, when they lifted to meet Carver's, were the color of a winter sky. "I call." Silas's voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. Carver's bravado shattered. He revealed his hand, a meager pair. Elena's stomach plummeted. She did not need to see Silas Blackwood's cards to know her fate had been sealed. He laid down 3 queens without a flicker of triumph, his expression unchanged. He had not won so much as simply concluded a transaction. The other men at the table grunted, scraping their chairs back. The game was over. Carver, red-faced and trembling with rage, shoved himself away from the table. "She's yours, Blackwood. Damned if I know what a man like you wants with her. Barren as your acres, I hear." The insult hung in the thick air, sharp and cruel. Silas's gaze didn't waver. He simply rose, his tall frame unfolding with a slow, deliberate economy of motion. He placed a few coins on the table for the house and then turned his eyes to her. For the first time, he looked directly at Elena, and she felt herself shrink under the intensity of his inspection. There was no lust in his eyes, no victory. There was only a profound weariness, a deep and abiding quiet that was more unsettling than any threat. He was not the monster she had imagined. He was something far more unnerving, an unknown country. "Come," he said. It was not a request. She followed him out of the saloon's suffocating heat into the cold shock of the night. The stars were a spray of frozen chips against black velvet, indifferent to the squalid dramas below. He didn't touch her, just led her to a simple buckboard wagon. The journey to his ranch was made in a silence as vast and profound as the landscape they moved through. The creak of the wagon wheels and the soft thud of the horse's hooves were the only sounds. She huddled in her thin shawl, studying his profile against the moonlight. He was a man carved from hardship, his face a map of sun and wind and sorrows she could not guess at. She had been passed from hand to hand her whole life, an orphan chattel, but this felt different. This was not the sweaty pawing of a drunkard like Carver. It was the dispassionate claim of a force of nature. When they finally arrived, the ranch was a collection of dark, angular shapes against the horizon. A small, solid house, a barn and corrals, all stark and isolated. It looked like the end of the world. He showed her to a small room off the main living space. It was spare, containing only a narrow cot with a clean but patched quilt, a washstand, and a single chair. There was a latch on the inside of the door. He paused in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame. "The work starts at sunrise," he said, and then he was gone, leaving her alone with the scent of pine wood, dust, and the deafening silence of her new life. Elena expected the worst, and when it did not come, the waiting was its own form of torment. The first morning, she awoke before dawn to the smell of coffee. In the main room, Silas Blackwood sat at the table, a plate of biscuits and jerky before him. Another plate was set for her. They ate in silence. He did not look at her. After, he led her not to his bed, but to the barn. He handed her a pitchfork. The work was relentless, punishing. She mucked stalls, hauled water, and mended fences under a sun that bleached the sky to a hazy white. Her hands, already calloused from her life as a vaquera, blistered and bled and then hardened anew. In the evenings, she would collapse onto her cot, every muscle screaming in protest, too exhausted for fear. Silas worked alongside her, his silence a constant, enveloping presence. He moved with a tireless rhythm, his actions precise and certain. He spoke only to give an instruction, his words clipped and necessary. Hold this steady, pull tight. Watch the graze back leg. He taught her through motion, not words. She learned the particular way he knotted a rope, the gentle firmness with which he handled a spooked horse, the patient way he worked tallow into worn leather to give it new life. She watched him, cataloging his habits, searching for the cruelty she knew must be coiled beneath his placid surface. But she found none. She saw only a man in a quiet, unending war with the land, and with the solitude that permeated his home like the dust. He was gentler with his animals than any man she had ever known. He would murmur softly to his old horse, his rough hand stroking its neck, a tenderness in his touch that he never showed to a human being. She realized he was testing her, not her obedience, but her endurance, her spirit. He had won a Vaquera in a card game, and he was determined to see if she was worthy of the name. One sweltering afternoon, he led a wild-eyed colt into the breaking pen. It was a beautiful, volatile creature of muscle and fear. "Think you can gentle him?" he asked, the longest string of words he had yet offered her. It was not a command, but a question, a challenge. She met his gaze, and for the first time she did not look away. She nodded. For days, she worked with the colt, using the patient methods her own father had taught her long ago. She used her voice, her stillness, her understanding of fear. Silas watched from the fence rail, never interfering, his face giving nothing away. The day she finally slipped a saddle onto the colt's back and rode him in a slow, trusting circle around the pen, she saw a flicker of something in Silas's eyes. It wasn't praise. It was acknowledgement. Weeks turned into a month, then two. A fragile, unspoken routine settled over them. One evening, a storm rolled in from the west, a bruised and violent wave of purple cloud. The wind howled, rattling the little house, and a cold, driving rain lashed against the windows. A cry from the barn, thin and desperate, cut through the gale. Calf born too early was struggling. Without a word, they pulled on their coats and ran into the maelstrom. The barn was a maelstrom of shadow and sound. Working by the unsteady light of a single lantern, they fought to save the tiny creature. He would brace the mother while Elena cleared the newborn's airways. She held the lantern steady as he administered a tincture. Their hands brushed in the chaos, their movements a synchronized dance of necessity. They were no longer owner and property, but two people fighting a common enemy. By dawn, the storm had passed, and the calf was breathing steadily, curled against its mother. Exhausted and soaked to the bone, they stood in the quiet aftermath. He looked at her, his face streaked with mud and rain. "Good work," he said. The simple words landed in her chest with the weight of a benediction. The next morning, a new pair of sturdy leatherwork gloves sat on the porch rail outside her door. She picked them up, the leather cool and smooth against her skin. It was more than he had ever said. It was an admission. He saw her. The brittle peace they had forged was shattered by the sound of a horseman approaching. Elena was splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a comfort, when she saw the rider. Her blood ran cold. It was Jedediah Carver, his face bloated and florid with whiskey and resentment. He reined his horse in hard, churning the dirt, his eyes already seeking her out, branding her with a look of venomous ownership. He dismounted, swaggering toward the porch where Silas had just emerged, wiping his hands on a rag. "Blackwood," Carver sneered, his voice thick. "Come to collect what's mine. That was a crooked game. Everyone knows it." Silas didn't move. He stood on the top step, his stillness a stark contrast to Carver's agitated energy. The game was fair, Carver. You lost. Now get off my land. Your land. Carver laughed, a wet, ugly sound. You got my property on your land. He jabbed a finger toward Elena. The girl. She's coming with me. Something inside Elena, a thing that had been dormant and frozen for years, finally broke free. This place. This silent, hard man. This punishing work. This stark and lonely life. It was hers. She had earned it with her own sweat and resilience. It was a sanctuary she had not asked for but would not now surrender. As Carver took a lurching step toward her, his hand outstretched to grab her arm, she didn't flinch or cower. She raised the axe, its weight familiar and steady in her hands. Don't touch me, she said, her voice low and clear, a stranger to her own ears. Carver stopped, his eyes wide with surprise, then narrowing with rage. But before he could react, Silas was moving. He descended the steps, not with haste, but with a lethal deliberation that was more frightening than any shout. He placed himself between Elena and Carver. She is not a thing to be won or lost, Silas stated, his voice quiet but carrying the finality of a closing door. She stays. You can't keep her. Carver roared, his drunken pride wounded. His hand went to the pistol at his hip. The world seemed to slow, the air growing thick and heavy. But Silas was already in motion. He didn't reach for a gun. He lunged forward, grabbing Carver's wrist with one hand and twisting, while his other forearm slammed into Carver's throat. It was not the clean action of a practiced gunslinger. It was the grim, efficient violence of a man protecting his home. The pistol clattered to the dust. Carver gasped, his face turning a mottled purple. Silas shoved him backward, sending him stumbling. Go, Silas commanded, his voice a low growl of contained fury. And do not come back. Carver, humiliated and choking, scrambled for his horse and fled, leaving a cloud of dust and impotent curses in his wake. The ensuing silence was heavier than any before it. The threat was gone, but the fragility of their world had been laid bare. Elena slowly lowered the axe, her arms trembling. She looked at Silas. He was leaning against a porch post, his breathing heavy. Blood seeped from a long gash on his forearm where Carver had scraped him in the struggle. Without thinking, she dropped the axe, went inside, and returned with a clean cloth and a bowl of water. He watched her approach, his expression guarded. She stopped before him and gently took his arm. He didn't pull away. As she carefully cleaned the wound, her touch was steady. It was an act of profound intimacy, an unspoken acknowledgement of the line that had just been crossed. He had not fought for a piece of property. He had fought for her, and she, in her own way, had fought for him. That night, the dynamic between them shifted, the last vestiges of master and possession dissolving into the cool desert air. They were two solitary people who had stood together against an intrusion. They spoke more in the days that followed, not in long conversations, but in shared observations about the weather, a sick calf, a fence line that needed repair. The silence was no longer a void, but a comfortable space they shared. One evening, as they sat before the small hearth, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, he finally broke his long-held quiet. "My wife, Sarah," he began, his voice raspy with disuse. He stared into the flames, his eyes seeing a past Elena could only imagine. She loved this land, said you could see the face of God in the sunsets. He paused, swallowing hard. She died in that room. He nodded toward the back of the house. Her and the boy. He never even drew a breath. The confession hung between them, a truth as stark and barren as the landscape outside. The doctor said there would be no more, that the fault was mine. He finally looked at her. His eyes filled with a grief so old it had become a part of him. "This land was barren," he said softly. "And so was I. It was all just silence. Until you came." Elena felt a profound ache for him, for the silent burden he had carried for so long. The word he spoke, barren, was the same one Carver had used as a weapon. For Silas, It was not an insult, but a raw, gaping wound. It was her turn to offer a piece of herself. "I never knew my mother," she said, her own voice quiet. "My father was a vaquero. He taught me about horses. When he died, I was passed from one cousin to an uncle, to anyone who needed a spare hand. I was never anything more than a debt to be paid or a mouth to feed." She looked at her own hands, calloused and strong. "I thought that's all I was." She had found a home not in a place, but in a purpose. Her worth was not in being owned, but in her own resilience. Months later, spring had breathed a fragile green life into the high chaparral. The ranch was changing. There was a small vegetable garden near the house, which Elena tended. They had acquired a few more head of cattle, their small herd growing. One evening, they stood together on the porch, watching as the setting sun painted the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and creosote. Silas held 2 tin cups of coffee, and he passed one to her. Their fingers brushed, a fleeting touch that held a world of unspoken understanding. It was a simple gesture, but it was one between equals. This was not a life of passion or romance in the conventional sense. It was something quieter, deeper, and more resilient. It was a partnership forged in silence, hardship, and a shared need to mend the broken pieces of their lives. A game of chance in a dusty saloon had not led to her ruin, but to her unmaking and remaking. Here, on this harsh and beautiful land, alongside this quiet, wounded man, Elena was no longer a wager. She was home,